The ad was simple. Buried deep in the classifieds under a vague headline, "Caretaker wanted for secluded forest property. Must be willing to work alone. Pay negotiable." The job description didn't offer much more detail, but it was the kind of opportunity I needed. One that promised quiet and isolation, away from the constant pressure of the city. It had been months since I'd been able to find any consistent work. The weight of unpaid bills and the endless cycle of dead-end jobs had taken its toll. I was desperate for something different. When I called the number, the voice on the other end was gruff and monotone. The man introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Grayson, the owner of the property. His voice sounded like it had weathered years of solitude, and his words carried a certain weight, as if he had grown accustomed to speaking only when necessary. "You're calling about the caretaker position?" he asked. "It's a simple job. Stay at the cabin, keep an eye on the land. It's a remote location, so you'll be isolated. I'll provide the essentials. You just need to make sure everything is running smoothly." It didn't take long for him to offer me the job. I think I was more desperate than he was for a caretaker. He didn't ask about my qualifications or experience. He seemed to care more about whether I could handle the isolation. That question sent a strange chill down my spine, but I assured him that I was fine with it. After all, solitude seemed preferable to the crushing reality I'd been facing. Dr. Grayson gave me the specifics. The forest was deep in the woods, about 2 hours outside the nearest town. There was a cabin on the property, and my duties would include ensuring the grounds remained undisturbed, checking in on a few maintenance items and keeping an eye out for wildlife that sometimes wandered too close to the property. It sounded simple enough. "Just one thing," he added before I hung up. "The forest has a history. It's not just a piece of land. It's been here for a long time. Some people have said the trees speak at night. But don't worry about that. Just keep to yourself. Stay in the cabin and don't venture too far. If you need anything, I'll come by once a month to check in." The mention of the trees speaking at night seemed more like an afterthought, almost as if it had been something Dr. Grayson had been trained to say to newcomers. Maybe it was just an oddity of the land, a local legend or superstition, but I brushed it off. The forest itself sounded like an oasis of quiet, something I could disappear into for a while. It was exactly what I needed to reset, a break from the noise, the demands, the weight of everything that had gone wrong in my life. A week later, I packed up my things, barely noticing the hollow feeling in my chest. The city had drained me of everything: ambition, hope, purpose. But out here in the woods, maybe I could find it again. Maybe, in the silence, I could rediscover myself. The drive to the forest was long, winding through dense trees that seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world outside didn't exist anymore. As I approached the entrance to the property, the road grew narrower, less traveled. The dense foliage swallowed up the space around me, and the air began to feel cooler. I couldn't shake the strange sensation that something ancient lay in these woods, something older than I could comprehend. The trees towered overhead, their gnarled limbs twisting like fingers, reaching out toward me as if they were watching, waiting. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I was greeted by silence. The forest surrounded me, a vast expanse of trees and brush, and the cabin itself was rustic yet sturdy. It had all the basic amenities, but it was clear that it had been untouched for a while. Dust covered the surfaces and the air inside was stale, but it was still better than anything I had back in the city. I unloaded my things, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was starting to fall, and a misting fog began to rise from the forest floor. I couldn't help but feel like I was entering a different world, one where time seemed to move differently. The trees, though silent for now, felt alive, their heavy presence pressing in on me from all sides. Before I could reflect too much on the strange atmosphere, a truck rumbled up the path. Dr. Grayson had arrived. He got out of the truck, his figure tall and weathered, with sharp features framed by a thick gray beard. He gave me a nod and a brief handshake, and without wasting much time, he handed me a set of keys to the cabin and the various maintenance sheds. "Keep the cabin locked," he said in his usual gruff voice, his gaze lingering on the trees behind me. "The forest can get unpredictable. Stay inside after dark. It's for your own good." With that, he turned and drove off, leaving me standing alone in the eerie quiet of the forest. The woods stretched out in every direction, a never-ending sea of trees and shadows. I couldn't help but feel a sudden weight on my chest. The trees, as strange as it seemed, felt like they were watching me, sizing me up, waiting for me to make a mistake. I shook it off. I was just overthinking things. This job was no different from any other. But as night fell and the winds started to whisper through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't just another place. It was alive, and it wasn't ready to let me go so easily. That first night in the forest was eerily quiet. After Dr. Grayson left, I spent a few hours unpacking and settling into the cabin. The cold, misty air outside felt different than the stale, city air I'd grown used to, and the silence in the forest was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. There were no cars, no street lights, no hum of distant voices or the occasional sirens. Just the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of owls. The cabin, though rustic, was cozy enough. It had everything I needed: a wood-burning stove, a small kitchenette, and a comfortable bed in the corner. The flickering light of the wood stove filled the room, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to dance with the crackling fire. I didn't have a TV, but that was fine. The silence was oddly comforting. I figured I could get used to it after a while. As evening descended and the forest began to fall into shadow, I decided to go for a quick walk around the perimeter of the cabin. The night was coming on fast, but I figured it was a good opportunity to stretch my legs and explore a bit. The path leading into the trees was narrow and overgrown, but I managed to make my way through the thick brush and towering trunks. The forest felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were pressing in on me. I could hear the crunch of twigs underfoot and the occasional rustle of leaves, but otherwise it was deathly silent. Not even the wind seemed to be stirring. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook my head, trying to clear the unsettling thoughts. As I wandered deeper, the trees grew denser, their branches stretching out in odd angles, twisting toward the sky in shapes that seemed almost too deliberate. The night air grew colder, and a light mist started to creep along the forest floor, making it feel even more isolated, as if the world had disappeared. The stillness was unsettling. I turned back toward the cabin, but something caught my eye. A figure standing still in the distance. It was hard to make out at first, just a silhouette among the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move. My heart began to race, and for a moment I thought I saw someone standing there, watching me. But as I took a step forward, the figure disappeared into the shadows. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? The isolation was starting to get to me, I realized. I had to shake it off. I was alone in the forest, and the quiet was beginning to play tricks on me. I made my way back to the cabin, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. By the time I got back, the sky had darkened completely, and the mist had thickened. I locked the door behind me and settled into the cabin, deciding it was best to stay inside for the night. I didn't know why, but there was something about the darkness outside that felt dangerous, like I wasn't supposed to be out there. I cooked myself a simple meal, the warmth of the stove filling the room, and tried to distract myself by reading a book. The fire crackled, and the lonely sound of the wind outside was the only thing breaking the silence. But as the hours passed, I noticed something strange. Every so often, the wind would seem to carry whispers, soft voices, faint and unintelligible. They weren't loud enough to make out, but they seemed to echo from the trees just beyond the window. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself it was just the wind blowing through the branches. But then, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing in my chest. The cabin felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing in on me. The voices, no, the whispers, seemed to be calling me, urging me to listen, to understand what they were saying. They came from the trees outside, the very same trees that Dr. Grayson had warned me about, the ones that seemed to watch. I paced around the cabin, trying to calm my nerves. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "It's just the wind. It's just the forest. You're imagining things." But the whispers were getting clearer, louder, like they were coming from just beyond the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the door, my hands trembling. Why was I so scared? I had to know what was going on. Stepping outside, I was immediately hit by the cold air and the mist that clung to the forest floor. The whispers were louder now, so distinct that I could almost make out words. The trees were speaking. I took a step closer to the forest, my flashlight cutting through the thick mist, illuminating the twisted trunks and gnarled branches that surrounded me. The sound of the whispers seemed to rise from the very earth beneath me, swirling around me like an invisible force. Suddenly, I froze. The whispers stopped. Silence. A thick, oppressive silence filled the air, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. I felt as if the entire forest had stopped breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. Then, from deep within the woods, a voice, deep and ancient, broke the silence. "Come closer. Listen to us." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even like any voice I had ever heard before. It was more like the sound of roots moving beneath the soil, the rustling of leaves, the groaning of trees. I could feel the ground beneath my feet vibrate with the force of the sound. My body froze, and for the first time I felt truly small, like the forest had always been here, watching, waiting. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and lock myself inside the cabin, but I was paralyzed. The trees had spoken to me. They wanted me to come closer. But why? What did they want? The moment the voice from the trees echoed through the mist, I felt something in the air shift, like a sudden pressure had been released and then pressed back in. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, the silence nearly deafening. The voice, it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human, yet it carried a weight, a sense of urgency and ancient power that made my skin crawl. "Come closer. Listen to us." The words seemed to come from all around me, surrounding me like the trees themselves had spoken, their voices intertwining in an almost hypnotic cadence. My heart raced, my body still locked in place as if I were rooted to the ground. I wanted to move, to run back to the safety of the cabin, but I couldn't. Something in those words, the invitation, held me in place. "Listen to us," the voice repeated, softer now, as if coaxing me closer, drawing me into the depths of the forest. I took a hesitant step forward, feeling a strange pull, something ancient, primal, like the trees were beckoning me to come closer, to hear their secrets. The forest, so dark and foreboding, now seemed to whisper with life, as if the woods themselves had awakened. The mist around me swirled, and the air grew even colder, biting at my skin. I took another step, then another. With every movement, I could feel the forest pressing in on me, its shadows twisting and shifting, like the trees themselves were alive, watching my every move. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed the whispers becoming clearer, as if the trees were speaking directly to me now, communicating through the rustle of their leaves and the creaking of their ancient trunks. It was eerie, unsettling, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin, making you question what's real and what isn't. The forest has always been here, child. It remembers. The voice wasn't just one, but many. Thousands of whispers intertwined, coming from every direction. I wasn't sure whether they were speaking to me individually or as one collective entity, but the message was unmistakable. The trees knew me. They were aware of me, of my presence in the forest. They wanted me to hear them, to understand what had happened here. You are part of the forest now. You will hear our voices just like the others before you. The words sent a chill through my bones. Others? I wasn't sure I wanted to know more, but something inside me urged me to keep going, to learn more about what lay hidden in these woods. The trees seemed to shift as I walked, their branches swaying despite the stillness of the air. The whispers weren't just words. They were sensations, an emotional pull that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. They filled my mind with images of the forest's past, ancient rituals, lost souls wandering, and something darker still, something old and forgotten that had been sealed away for generations. Suddenly, the whispers fell silent. The absence of sound was almost worse than the cacophony. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I looked around frantically, but the woods were as still as death. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught sight of something, a shadow moving within the trees. It was impossible to make out the figure completely. It was like a dark, shifting shape, human, yet somehow not. It moved too quickly, vanishing between the trunks before I could focus on it. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I felt as though the forest was alive in ways I didn't understand, as if the trees themselves were part of something greater, something ancient and powerful. The ground beneath my feet seemed to hum, and the air around me felt thick, as though the forest itself was breathing. Then I heard it again, closer this time, the voice deeper, stronger, resonating from all directions. You have come to the heart of the forest. The trees speak because you are here. You will listen now. The trees were speaking to me directly, and the sound was too much. The whispers filled my ears, a constant barrage of voices, memories, and pleas that seemed to be coming from the very earth beneath me. We remember the ones before you. We remember their faces, their cries. They came seeking knowledge, just like you. They listened, and they became one with us. Now you will listen too. You cannot turn back. You are part of the forest now. I took a step back, my pulse quickening, my legs trembling. The forest felt alive, too alive, as though it were reaching out to claim me. The weight of the voices pressed on me, suffocating me. No one escapes the forest, not those who hear the trees. The words sent a jolt of panic through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I turned to run, but the path ahead had changed. The trees had shifted. The branches were closer now, crowding in on me like silent, watching eyes. The path I had walked was gone. I was trapped in the heart of the forest. I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, the flashlight casting frantic shadows on the trees. The shape was closer now, tall, dark, and formless. I couldn't make out any details, but the air around it felt colder, heavier. The voice was louder now, clearer. "You cannot leave." I tried to run, but my feet felt like lead. I was being drawn deeper into the forest, the trees speaking to me, pulling me toward the heart of the woods. And then I realized what they were saying. I was never meant to leave. I stumbled through the dense underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had grown louder, filling my ears with an overwhelming chorus of voices that seemed to come from the very roots beneath my feet. The trees were alive, and they knew me, knew everything about me. There was no escape from their reach. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing on me from every direction, as though the forest itself were closing in, trapping me within its embrace. I reached a clearing, the moonlight filtering through the thick canopy above, but there was no relief. The air was cold and heavy, the atmosphere suffocating. The trees around me seemed to be closing ranks, their twisted branches looming like silent sentinels. I could hear the leaves rustling, but this time it wasn't the gentle whisper of wind. It was something else, something darker, more purposeful. "You cannot run from the forest, child." The voice rang out, not just in my ears, but in my mind. It was everywhere, coming from every direction, growing stronger with every passing second. I spun around, desperate to see where it was coming from, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the trees, their gnarled trunks and branches reaching out like the fingers of a long dead hand, grasping at the air. The forest seemed to be alive, watching, judging. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You are here to hear us. You have awakened us. Now you must listen. The curse of the forest has claimed you, just as it claimed the others." Others? The words echoed in my mind, reverberating with an unseen weight. I couldn't breathe. What curse? What did they mean by the others? My pulse quickened, and I began to back away, but the ground beneath me felt unsteady, as if it were shifting, changing with every step I took. I had to understand. I had to know what this place was, what had brought me here, and why the forest had claimed me. I turned around, determined to find some way to break free from the suffocating grip of the trees, but the path was gone. I couldn't see the cabin. I couldn't see anything except the dark forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was then that I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't alone. More voices, coming from the trees themselves, murmuring, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But I could feel their words in my chest, in the deepest corners of my mind. The voices weren't just whispering, they were commanding. "You've come to us, and now you will learn the truth." The voice was deep, resonating like the thunder of a storm. The forest is cursed. Those who hear the voices are bound to it, as were those before you. The spirits of the forest, those lost to time, dwell within the trees. You will join them soon enough. The trees creaked, their branches swaying, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet, as if the entire forest were awakening. It was as though the trees were sharing their memories with me. Memories of sacrifice, of rituals, of people who had come here long ago seeking something in the heart of the forest. And in the end, they had all disappeared, lost to the forest forever. Their spirits, their souls, had become trapped in the very wood itself, bound to the trees for eternity. I could feel it now, the weight of their suffering, their pain. The curse wasn't just an ancient spell, it was the land itself, alive with the trapped souls of the past, the voices of those who had been lost to time. The whispers shifted again, growing louder, more urgent. You have been chosen. You will stay, just like the others. You will listen, and you will never leave. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the pressure in my chest building, as if the very air in the forest were tightening around me. The trees were closing in, their branches reaching down, their roots stirring beneath the earth. I felt a pull, a deep magnetic force drawing me toward the center of the forest. No, I gasped, shaking my head. I won't stay. I can't. But it was too late. The voice seemed to envelop me, swallowing my resistance, drowning out my thoughts. You belong to the forest now. Suddenly, I was no longer standing on the ground. I felt my body being pulled upward, as though the trees themselves had taken hold of me. My legs were lifted off the ground, and I screamed in terror as I felt my body being drawn into the air, as if I were becoming part of the very trees themselves. The pain was excruciating. It felt like my limbs were being pulled apart, stretched across the forest. I could feel my skin tightening, my body shifting into something unnatural. My breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break free. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The pain, the fear, everything. I was back on the ground, my feet firmly planted beneath me. But the forest around me had changed. The trees were still, and the whispers had fallen silent. I looked down at my hands, horrified to see that they were covered in thick bark, the skin rough and textured. The branches of the trees seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat, as though I had become part of the forest itself. The curse was real. The forest had claimed me. My body trembled as I looked down at my hands, still covered in the thick, rough bark. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore, only the cold, hard texture of wood beneath my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, a heavy thudding that echoed through my veins. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound that escaped was no longer human. It was a whisper, low, mournful, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. The forest around me had changed. It wasn't just the trees anymore, the entire landscape felt alive, as if the earth itself was breathing. The air was thick with the presence of something ancient and overwhelming. The whispers, those voices that had called to me from the very first night, were now louder and more insistent, reverberating through the ground beneath my feet and the air around me. It was as though the forest had a mind of its own, and I was now part of it. I looked up, panic rising in my chest as I realized the trees were no longer just stationary figures in the distance. They were moving, shifting, swaying, leaning closer, as if they were watching me. Their branches seemed to stretch out, as though they were reaching for me. Their bark, once rough and dull, now gleamed under the moonlight, their eyes, dark and ancient, looking directly at me. They knew, the forest knew what I had become. You are ours now. The voice, ancient and low, came from all around me. It wasn't just one voice, but a chorus, the combined voices of countless souls, those who had wandered too deep into the forest, those who had heard the call and been claimed by the trees. I could feel their presence, the weight of their lives, their desires, their losses. They were all part of the forest now, and so was I. We are not just trees, child. We are the keepers of this land. We are the forgotten. We are the ones who were betrayed, trapped here for eternity. And now, you too will listen. I staggered backward, my legs unsteady beneath me as the forest seemed to close in around me. My breath caught in my throat as the reality of what had happened hit me. The trees. They weren't just trees. They were trapped spirits, souls that had been bound to the forest by ancient magic. Their voices were the echo of every soul that had been taken by the forest. The whispers I had heard weren't just words. They were memories, pleas, the collective anguish of the lost souls that had become part of this place. I began to understand. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a sanctuary for those who had been sacrificed, whose lives had been consumed by the ancient power that resided here. And I had been drawn into it just as they had. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't just the new caretaker. I wasn't just a witness. I was part of it now. The forest had claimed me. I could feel it deep within me. The pull of the trees, the connection to the very land I stood on. The curse wasn't just some mystical force. It was life itself, twisted and bound to the earth. The trees weren't just speaking to me. They were consuming me, merging me with their ancient power. But there was more to this. The forest's history wasn't just a tale of tragedy. There was a purpose to this curse, a purpose that had to be revealed. I had to know the truth, the real reason why the forest called to me, why it chose me. Suddenly, a vision flashed before my eyes. I saw a figure, a tall man, cloaked in shadow, standing before an altar deep within the heart of the woods. Dr. Grayson. His face was cold, expressionless, but his hands were raised high, holding an ancient relic, a stone glowing with an eerie light. It was the artifact, the key to the forest's power. I saw the ritual, a dark and twisted ceremony where the land had been bound to the trees through blood and sacrifice. The people who had come before me, those who had sought the forest's power, had been trapped within the trees, their souls forever bound to the land. The vision shifted. I saw the sacrifice that had started it all, the ritual that had begun this cycle of suffering, the blood that had been spilled to fuel the forest's cursed life. The souls that had been lost, their spirits forever entwined with the trees, watching, waiting. And then the voice came again, softer now, but no less powerful. The ritual has been broken, child. You are part of it now. You are a part of us, just as the others before you. We will never be forgotten. The forest will never be silenced. The truth was laid bare before me, the weight of it pressing on me like a mountain. The forest had been cursed long ago, and I had been drawn into it because of my own emptiness. The forest fed off that emptiness, pulling in those who were desperate, those who needed to escape from the world. But the curse wasn't just about the forest. It was about the forest's need to survive. The trees, the spirits, they were all connected, all tied to the land. And now, so was I. You will never leave. The words rang in my ears as the forest seemed to tighten its grip around me. I was part of it now, trapped in the curse, bound to the trees for eternity. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The forest wasn't just a place of ancient trees and whispers. It was a living entity, feeding off the souls that had entered its domain, using them to maintain its power and preserve its endless curse. I had become a part of that curse. I wasn't merely the caretaker of the woods anymore. I was a prisoner, bound to its spirits, its ancient rituals. I could feel the weight of it, the pressure building in my chest. My body ached as if the forest were physically pulling me into its heart. The trees, their voices, their presence, had become part of me. The whispers, the visions, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and they were speaking to me now more clearly than ever. You will never leave. The voice rang out again, louder this time, almost like an echoing command coming from all around me. The air around me felt thick, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the deep, rhythmic groaning of the trees. It was as though they were breathing, alive, aware of my every movement. I had two choices, two paths before me. Stay here and accept my place in the forest, become another lost soul, another voice among the whispers, or break the curse, even if it meant losing myself completely in the process. There was no guarantee that breaking the curse would set me free. In fact, the trees had made it clear that those who tried to break the cycle were never seen again. I thought of Dr. Grayson, the man who had led me here, whose actions had set this entire chain of events into motion. He knew about the curse, knew about the sacrifices, and yet he had brought me to this place anyway, probably because he thought I would be another tool in the forest's endless cycle. But, as much as I despised the man for using me as a pawn, I couldn't ignore what the forest had told me. It needed me. It had chosen me. And now I had to decide if I would accept my fate or try to destroy the very thing that had claimed me. The trees began to close in around me, their twisted limbs stretching toward the sky, their shadows casting long, unnatural shapes. The very earth beneath my feet seemed to pulse with the energy of the forest, the ancient curse binding me to it. The wind stirred, but there was no relief in its cool embrace, only more voices, more calls, more whispers in the dark. You belong here now. Join us. The trees shifted, their movement slow but deliberate, and in that moment I realized that they weren't simply alive. They were aware, conscious. They had seen the countless souls who had entered this forest before me, and now they wanted me to stay, to become part of them, to feed their hunger for eternity. But I wasn't sure I could accept that. Could I let myself become part of this curse? Could I give in to the forest's power and be bound to it forever? In the distance, I thought I saw a figure, a shadow moving through the trees. It was Dr. Grayson, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear as he moved through the woods, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if he were being pursued. He came closer, but the trees seemed to grow taller and thicker around him, pushing him deeper into the woods. You can't escape. None of us can. His voice trembled, and for a moment, I almost felt pity for him. He was just as much a victim of the forest as I was, perhaps even more so. Then, just as suddenly as the figure appeared, it vanished. The trees closed in, and I felt a deep pull in my chest. The forest was trying to pull me into its heart, into its very core where the artifact lay, where the curse had begun. But I couldn't just surrender. Not yet. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to break the curse without becoming part of the forest forever. I had to try. I wasn't just going to accept this fate. I turned and ran. My legs felt heavy, my breath sharp and ragged, but I pushed forward, fighting against the pull of the forest. I heard the whispers behind me, growing louder as the trees seemed to close in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. If I stayed, I would become just another part of this cursed land. But if I ran, if I could break the connection, I might have a chance to escape. The trees seemed to twist, their branches reaching out to stop me. But I kept going, pushing forward into the heart of the woods. The air grew colder, the night darker, and the whispers grew louder until I thought I would be swallowed by them. I stumbled through the thickening forest, but then, in the distance, I saw something. The clearing, the place where the ritual had begun. The altar was there, but the artifact was gone. The trees had taken it. In a final act of desperation, I fell to my knees, clutching the earth beneath me, calling out to the forest, begging for release. But the trees didn't listen. They never had. The curse was too old, too strong. The final choice was clear. I could stay and let the curse claim me, becoming part of the forest forever, or I could leave and take my place among the lost souls of the woods. But would I truly escape?